Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Adventures Through the Mind. I'm your host, as always, James W. Gesso. This podcast explores topics relevant and related to psychedelic culture, medicine, and research, and always with the underlying question of how we can work with and through our psychedelic experiences become better people, not just for ourselves, but for all those with whom we are nested in relationship, individually and collectively. And it is with respect to the collective that we welcome Martijn Schirp onto the show for this episode, Safeguarding the Sacredness of Psychedelics Against Profit-Driven Industrialization. And the reason it's in respect to the collective is that there is a larger process underway that involves psychedelics and involves quite a bit of capital, as in money invested, that is going to have incredible impact on the collective understanding and the collective integration of psychedelics into the modern world. And that impact isn't necessarily going to be a benevolent one by default. And it's that wondering that we're going to explore for this episode. Now, like all episodes, I have written an overture for this one, which you can read at jameswgesso.com for the in the show notes, episode 161. But I will read it to you here. So yes, here's the overture. Money corrupts, or does it? It is certainly the case that the influx of money or capital into an industry, or community for that matter, shifts the dynamics of that industry. And the more capital that comes in and the quicker it does, the greater that shift in dynamic. Often this shift tends to have a degrading effect on whatever was at the center of that industry. Usually because the more money that flows into something, the more likely it is that those with money will use that something to make more money, to make profit. Meaning that eventually the dynamics that surrounded whatever that industry was once about becomes corrupted as the industry itself shifts towards being about profit and driven by profit motives. This calls to mind for me the first primary question, which is it the capital, the money itself that corrupts, or how we wield it? So let that question sit in mind as we move on to the next part of this overture. This influx of capital is the growing case for psychedelics, as more people with a lot of money are beginning to see the potential profitability of psychedelics and psychedelic therapy as an industry. And although the kind of corruption I just spoke to, corruption by profit-driven motives, is generally a sad outcome for any industry, there is something especially sad and even worrisome about how the influx of profit-driven motives will affect psychedelics in particular. Why? Because the psychedelic experience is one of deep sacredness, and that sacredness has something of profound value to offer both humanity and, through humanity, life itself in the troubled times our planet is presently in. And there is a real concern that the profit-driven industrialization of psychedelics that is now underway threatens to corrupt that sacredness and all that it can offer us as it shifts the cultural dynamics that hold psychedelics themselves, as well as us within our psychedelic experiences. So along with the question I just posed a moment ago about whether or not it is the money itself or how we wield it that corrupts, this calls to mind a second question, which is, how do we safeguard the sacredness of psychedelics against whatever potential corruption could come from profit-driven industrialization? And it is with the foundation of these two questions that we welcome Martijn Schirp to the show. Martijn is the co-founder of Synthesis Institute, a psychedelic retreat center in the Netherlands. As CEO for 2 years, he has stewarded Synthesis through early concept to maturity with the vision of making psychedelic tools accessible in a safe, legal, and modern context. Under Martijn's leadership, Synthesis has heralded a world-class professional standard for psychedelic wellness and mental health. Furthermore, having previously co-founded High Existence and Apotheosis, Martijn is an experienced entrepreneur in the wellness and transformative space. As a writer, speaker, and interviewer on psychedelic subject matter, he was one of the first in the space to anticipate the microdosing revolution in early 2014. Applying his academic background in interdisciplinary science and philosophy, his work and identity as an entrepreneur is strongly influenced by ecopharmacological thought and by his decade-long practice with Buddhism and shamanism. He is currently focused on scaling opportunities for flourishing, well-being, and transformation through the synthesis of contemplative practices, immersive technology, and psychedelics. For this interview, Martijn and I wonder about the potential harms that will come from the profit-driven industrialization of psychedelics and psychedelic therapy, how we might safeguard the sacredness of psychedelics and people seeking psychedelic therapy against those harms, and where and how he sees Synthesis Institute as attempting to do so. We also talk about cultural maturity, the systemic issues that lead to broad sweeping ill health amongst modern people, why no, it's not, quote, just business, psychedelics' role in helping us to learn to be better people in uncertain times, indigenous issues, and our personal sense of where we land in the long history of colonial harm, as well as why choosing love ain't easy, but well worth it. So that's the overture. We're going to jump into the interview in just a moment, but first I'd like to give a huge thanks to my patrons on Patreon, especially the people whose names are listed on the screen here on YouTube or in the description to this episode. Those people have been giving significantly, and some of which for a long time, so thank you very much. If you are not yet a patron of the show and you are finding value in it, please do consider becoming one. As little as a cup of coffee once a month is much appreciated. You could also leave a one-time donation to the show through PayPal or cryptocurrency. And of course, non-financial support such as just sharing this around, giving it a like and a subscribe is also appreciated. So thank you very much for doing so, and without any further ado, here is this episode of Adventures Through the Mind, episode 161 with Martijn Schirp, Safeguarding the Sacredness of Psychedelics Against Profit-Driven Industrialization. Enjoy. Martijn Schirp, welcome to Adventures Through the Mind.
Thanks for having me.
So,
good to see you.
Good to see you. It's funny because we've been talking for like 25 minutes.
Yeah.
But it's official now. We're seeing each other and recording. So to start us off, why don't you give us a little description of Synthesis and what you're doing there?
Sure. Synthesis is an organization that provides legal and safe access to psychedelics. It started out as a retreat organization, really with the intent of trying to find a model that works for us moderns, the hyper-individualized, supposed to be rational creature that we believe we are. Having a background in scientific research myself, and also having been deeply touched by different cultures using these medicines in a very deep and sacred way, I felt that for a psychedelic organization to really create value, it needs kind of have to have both perspectives. So on one hand, the kind of critical or skeptical scientific attitude that we can't take things on face value. We have to explore what the facts are of the world on one hand, and guard against our own biases and our sometimes false forms of story making. And on the other hand, the wisdom that has been passed down, often with great care or great responsibilities on how to deal with the fact of the world. And so the way I always explain it, research and science can really help us, for example, optimize for safety or efficacy. But you can be the greatest scientific researchers of psychedelics and understand all of it from a scientific perspective. And yet that's not going to help you if you take a really high dose of psychedelic. Something else is needed, and that's both experience and understanding and form of virtues relating to whatever unconscious material that comes up. And so, we felt that we needed to have both sides of the story, both perspectives, and to the extent they're even compatible. And so this is ongoing conversation in the organization as well. But it was the founding, this kind of the founding story of synthesis. How do we synthesize these ways of being that I don't think we moderns can do without?
That's great. I didn't know that about, like, now that you're explaining that synthesis. Oh, that makes sense. That as like a name for your organization. It's all that like clicks really, really nicely.
It's coming together. Yeah. So it started out as a retreat. Yeah, we started out as a retreat organization. We were a bunch of very idealistic young men and women that all came from the psychedelic space, and were deeply connected to the underground and to the story of the Renaissance and being part of this larger movement. And then over time, we've decided to, okay, how can we integrate some of these psychedelic values? Not that they're universal, but I think there are ways that we hope and dream psychedelics can change the world. And it became clear that, okay, there's a lot of capital that's coming to flow into the space, and that's definitely going to change like how we relate to basically the research and the development. And so we wanted to see if we could honor these insights that we've got into our own medicine work, but actually build an organization around that, like an institute that would honor, hopefully what will be like a authentic spiritual / scientific psychedelic tradition of the West.
I want to ask you more about capital, the influx of capital and the impact it's having on the sort of both the operational but also the narrative space of psychedelic work globally. But first, I think this is important. A lot of people have the sense of the Netherlands being quite liberal, but it's actually quite an amazing opportunity that the Netherlands, that you at Synthesis have had, that you are able to legally provide psilocybin to people. And I'm wondering if you could just give us a little quick breakdown on the legality of how it was that you were able to be like, yeah, let's start this thing. And then it just be like a thing you can start, rather than having to go through whatever years and miles and hundreds of thousands of dollars of legislative approval and stuff.
Yeah, it's actually an enormous privilege. Like being Dutch, there is this system called a tolerance beleid. What is beleid? Tolerance policy, and it's kind of a strange situation we're in. So the truffles containing psilocybin, they're legal, or they're not illegal, and so they are just considered a food. And but the psilocybin that's tested to be in it is illegal. That's still on the opium law.
Okay.
And so basically, the truffles are seen. You can see them through three different laws. You can see them through the food laws. Okay, you have to store them safely, and there's an expiration date, and you shouldn't take them after, because you can get sick, etc. So there's all these, like the same way restaurants deal with their food. Then there's the opium law, which is should govern truffles, but they don't. So there's a huge law of all the different mushrooms, but truffles are not on there. So as long as they grow under the ground and they don't pop up their heads, it's okay. Same with mycelium, actually. Not many people know that. There are some companies developing that now. But you can grow psilocybin containing mycelium on different grains, etc. So that's kind of where the weird relationship starts with the truffles. And then there's the third law, which basically, and there's a bunch of laws on the category of medicine, because it clearly has a psychological effect on people, and it could be used as medicine. But because Synthesis is not a medical organization, we we're not allowed to use it in a medicinal way. So that's why we clearly screen people that if they come with any intentions to necessarily to heal, we're not equipped for that, and we're actually working with like health professionals. Like we do that in the consulting way, and they can consult us, but they can't, for example, make assessment on specific cases because that would be medical care. And so there's all these different types of there's very little wiggle room, but there's enough wiggle room for us to have built an organization, which is the biggest argument I think. Not against decriminalization. I'm very pro decrim, but it's not enough, and it's not enough because it doesn't allow for actually capital relationships between an organization, so you can actually build infrastructure. And you need infrastructure, I think, to fully integrate psychedelics into our lives. I think underground is just not enough for most people.
Well, maybe that will maybe that'll come out a little bit more flushed out. Get a first flush mushrooms a little bit later, a second flush later on, maybe. So that's okay. That's cool to know. I didn't know that about psilocybin itself being illegal. I understood that that the mushroom became illegal at some point, and then somebody developed a way to just basically cultivate them as sclerotia, and then all of a sudden truffles were a thing, and then
there are different myths around it.
Oh yeah,
I've heard different conflicting stories about someone on the committee that didn't want that to happen, so they took off the truffles. I've heard stories of people that had mushroom companies, and they were like, this is not okay. So they went to the I think up to the European court, and they won, and then they had this exception, and it all concluded into truffles are legal, and people are using it. I think 100,000 people a year used in the Netherlands, and there are some cases where it doesn't end well, but often, by far the biggest is people have a big anxiety attack and they end up in the hospital. And of course, there's some worse cases as well, but in general, it's very safely tolerated.
And in the long run, I mean, psilocybin, cannabis, whatever it is, between psilocybin and cannabis, for example, compared to the harms of alcohol, it's like no competition. That alcohol is just on so many levels, so much more dangerous, and yet you could literally funnel it into your mouth legally. So, but let's leave that discussion there because I want to get into discussing the impact of capital into the psychedelic space. So I've got a little thing I've written down so I can hold it in my mind. So pardon my reading. One of the major veins in psychedelic culture right now is the influx of capital and a profit-driven industrialization of providing and supplying psychedelics. There is a lot of positive opportunities this represents, but many people are concerned about the potentially negative impact of this profit-driven industrialization. So being that you're really in the front nose of the wake of all of this, because your organization is such a significant one in the world right now, maybe you can give us a sense of your lay of the land of the psychedelic space and the concerns you're holding about the direction the industry seems to be heading.
Wow, huge topic. I have a few things that we have been discussing internally in the organization and with like-minded colleagues across the world. First of all, let me be fully clear. I love being an entrepreneur. I've always have, and it's, I think, an amazing opportunity. So I don't believe capitalism is inherently bad, for example, and I think that's actually a very disempowering position to take. I do think that capitalism brings along a lot of illnesses, and it can and often does empower the wrong set of behaviors. And so I think there are different perspectives I think you can take on the development of the psychedelic space. And one of them is often what you see in many industries, which there's a bunch of people that come together just because they love it. And they come to all kinds of crazy insights and amazing creations. And that's awesome. That's like the early psychedelic space, right? And after a time, other people see what they're building. They want to be part of that. They're not necessarily the first kind of core group that would have found it otherwise if that first group didn't exist. But they're still they're close to the ethos and they're close to the mission. They just want to spread it. And then there's a third group that sees this as an amazing opportunity. They don't really care necessarily about what it does. They see, okay, this is the next cannabis. This is the next, capital play. And so what you get is, with the influx of capital, you see that those who are very good at raising capital or are already privileged with access with capital, they get a seat on the table. They know what to say. They go around, they learn what to say. They don't necessarily have done work themselves. And without having done the work themselves, they might have some understanding. Like, I don't want to discredit anyone's personal experience, but they don't have that deep inner knowing that the first group had. And so there's this dialectic of capital coming in, and those who are good at marketing themselves or good having access, they are the ones who get a seat on the table. And those are not necessarily the same people that know what's best for the integration development of the space. And therefore, because of that incongruence, there's another dialectic where, because of private ownership, there is, if you start a company, often at one point, and it takes a lot of time, like a lot of effort to start a company. It's really a full-time commitment. It takes a lot of you. And at one point, people get burned out, for example, or they get an amazing offer to be bought out, all the value they created. And what happens is that ownership changes, and those who get control of a company don't always want to honor the fundamental intention why the company was created. And so what happens is that over time, often in capitalism, the purpose of a company and the people who control it they come at odds. And so the trend towards decision making is, for example, profit maximization versus value creation versus rate of innovation versus honoring past commitments, honoring all relationships. And so you get these companies that are actually kind of sick simply because they just want to mine as much value from their clients, from their teams, from past value that was created. And I think that's going to be a problem in the psychedelic space. And I think this year already you start to see companies that started with great intentions, great teams, but for some reason or another, they didn't make it. They ran out of money, and so they're bought on pennies on the dollar, and everything they've created that could just be bought and could be used for very different purposes. For example, profit maximization, and that's, I think, how you create a system where the purpose, what I think with psychedelics is, which is to help us awaken, help us to become more responsible beings on this planet, to heal the intergenerational trauma, to understand how deeply connected we are. That kind of stuff is pushed aside, and the assessment is, okay, how do we make decisions that raises the stock price, or leads to an exit for me as a founder? And that is at odds, I think, with the work. And so, yeah, this has been a very heated debate in our organization, because everything we're creating, like, if that can just be sold, and a few select group of people benefit from that, but everyone else who contribute to it, bear the cost, like, then that system is inherently set up to do harm. And if psychedelics is trying to, figure out how we do less harm, that doesn't work.
I want to maybe zoom in or put a spotlight on something. And that was a beautiful sort of overview. And the spotlight being what goes wrong in your mind, having that you have been running this organization now where you've been supporting, I assume, thousands of people at this point to go through the experience of consuming the truffle food and having a non-medical experience. Right. But you've supported a lot of people through this, right? So you see what has worked and hasn't worked, at least insofar as your experience thus far, right? And what has been necessary for you as an organization, you Synthesis, and also you, Martin. And with that in mind, and considering, okay, so what happens now with the influx of this capital? Like you just spoke to, okay, if you decided to just sell your company to, whatever larger investment firm also buys the other psychedelic companies or whatever it is, or it wants to get bought out by Pfizer or something, heaven forbid. So what do you see as what exactly, at least in your mind, would go wrong there for the people? Not just there's for the psychedelic space, right? Like what happens to the culture, but then where do you see as the potential harms of how that kind of profit-driven, profit maximization management will impact the actual people going in for these experiences?
Well, one of the fastest way to increase profit is to let more people in and not really care about what happens to them. And one of the, for example, this is we're as guilty as almost any other company in this, because how many companies are really investing in integration versus the experience? And so there's this, even the business and the way the business is structured is we're way more focused on getting new capital in for our own self-survival versus continuing building value for those who already provided capital. And so these are ways in decision making that capital relations automatically bring in certain incentives of certain factors that color. And so, it's, and I'm not saying that capital is not important. I think to create a self-sustainable organization, the team needs to be paid well, and we need to keep investing in learning ourselves. And learning is, as an organization, especially these early days, it's incredibly expensive. We just talked about the legal ramifications of making a mistake. It's because we're so early. It's nobody really knows. There's an analysis, discussion on discussion, and those are not cheap on the level that we're doing them. But the risk is, let's say I'm totally burned out, and an investor comes and says, "Here's a big pack of money." Often founders they set up the company in such a way that they could personally benefit the most. And, some team members probably too. And, you've already built these amazing relationship with your clients and trusting, but you don't know that the new owner honors those. And so it's like, where does that capital go to? Does that keep investing into the purpose of the company? And will the previous commitments be honored or not? And often the answer is no. Like, often it's not done with integrity, and it's the often the person that buys it is looking at making a return, and they either want to sell it for more, and that means the prices need to go up, or quality needs to go down. It's that simple. And so and I think that's the danger of form of ownership that doesn't consider them fully stewards of the work, that believes they can reduce the relationship with the client and the relationship with the team just to their economic status. And I'm not saying you can remove that. I think that's also a mistake, and that's too idealistic. But we need to consider why are we doing this? What is the fundamental purpose? And then we need to protect that. And we need to protect it in such a way that it cannot be undermined in any way, no matter what the incentive is, the financials. And there are ways to do that. People have solved that problem, thank God, because I wouldn't have found out how to do that. But there's ways, and we are in the process. We already implemented the commitment. So the commitment is set. It's just going to take a few years at least to fully mature into that vision. But our course is set, and it's now fixed. So I'm very happy with that.
So maybe we could talk about that more in a minute. I assume what you're talking about is this kind of like steward ownership model. I think we were talking about previously in our prep call.
Correct.
But I think I really want to make it feel really palpable for the listeners what the consequences are as to the person showing up to get psilocybin. At synthesis, it isn't therapy, but broad scale, it's moving towards therapy. And what that will be like if an exclusively privatized, profit-driven clinical model takes over the space, and there's the maximization of profits through hiking prices, minimizing costs, and so on and so forth. And but thinking about how does that apply to somebody who's going in for a psychedelic experience? It's like, well, you're not going to get good administrative care. You're probably not going to get good prep care. You're probably not going to get very well-designed spaces, well-trained peoples, and you might not be able to rely on that organization to hold you in the experience before or afterwards in an effective way. And everything that comes, all the potential of these experiences is very much in how those experiences unfold, leading up to, during, and following. And if all of that is haphazard, if all of that is managed from this, like, how do we make the most money? Chances are the way you make the most money is by making sure that the person in there is that the least amount of money is invested in the person actually paying for the experience. Right. And this is what's coming to mind. And then if you think about how that'll result just in your experience from what kind of care you'll get, well, I'm just wrapping this out now, it's like, it's evident what direction that's going to go for your experience, and it's likely not going to go well. And if you think about the kind of experience, and this is moving into a more spiritual, maybe metaphysical, what kind of experience is even going to be available to you in this sort of psycho-spiritual context of that kind of an industry, then your premise of stewardship, safeguarding the sacred, it's like, well, is the sacred even going to arrive? Is it even going to be there? What kind of experience are you going to have? Is it really going to actually be the thing that it maybe once would have been before it got taken over by Moloch or whatever? Anyway, so that's my TED Talk. How do you feel about what I just said there?
I don't feel great about that, but it's gonna happen. There's a strategy as a company you can do to maximize profits, and it's gonna happen because some people don't care, but some people don't know better. Some people are driven by the context and the necessity of their lives. Some people are not set up for success or for difference. But what's going to happen is some companies are they're going to try and find a niche to promote the maximum, let's say, form of well-being while delivering the least amount of it. And that gap, they can exploit that gap. And and I
So you just
but I
froze there
think
for a second. You were saying,
yeah, I don't want to throw any stones, but I think there is an argument to be made that, for example, being ketamine delivered at your home with a guided meditation app, and that's good enough, and that's actually framed as solving our mental health pandemic. I think it's problematic.
mm-hmm.
I don't think you can ethically promise that, and I'm not saying that some people wouldn't benefit from that, but is that really, if we look back 50, 100 years from now, that's the pinnacle of integration of psychedelics in our culture versus the potential that it has? And it's not what, it's not what I want to do with my capacity for entrepreneurship. And so our commitment is different. And that's a different path, because we sometimes joke that like every single person in our organization is a pretty strong idealist, and nobody wants to back down from what they believe in. And I think that's a beautiful thing. It's very creative, but it's also very hard to actually create and innovate and build systems and ideas and processes and build this experience that is really deeply valuable and can really hold this wide diversity of people that come to us. And then, you have to really, let's think of the first retreat. Like doing one retreat it's not the easiest, but it's also not very hard. If you're a skilled professional and you're a therapist and you have a breath worker there and a meditation teacher, you can hold pretty good retreats as a one-off. But then if you want to do more retreats, that's already much more difficult. And then you have multiple retreat teams and you want to train them, that's already a lot more difficult. And then if you want to train the trainers, because they also need to learn, and so you want to build this learning environment where we constantly learn with all the material that's coming up, because we don't really know what they are, what they could be. Like they're in the break open this mysterious way of being that is incredibly profound and touching, and often helps us realize everything we went wrong and all the responsibility we need to take, and how we're not ready and we're not wise enough to handle the crises of our time. And yet it also shows there's no other path. We have to take that responsibility. And yeah, what's the proper container for that? And that's what we really try to do, with a certain degree of success. But there's we don't know what we don't know. But we hope we will have decades more of learning and innovation to make some sense of what's happening in these circles.
If I were to just, in the last, say, 60 seconds of you talking, if I were to just forget that you were talking about psychedelics, very much feels like talking about a larger global place that we're in right now. Is how do we deal with all of this? We don't know. And one of the things that that's being woken up for me, it's something that I hold often and consider, and I'm hearing it come out, is that we don't really know yet what to do or what is to be done, but there's a way of learning how to show up to the not knowing yet that is still effective action and is still in alignment with the yet to be realized thing that will be the what that was necessary. And I don't know if that's coherent, but I'm feeling that in the sort of like in what I'm interpreting as the quality of inquiry that you're holding on this topic, which I think can expand out beyond just psychedelics is such a huge concept or a huge thing, right? But like can really expand out to a lot of areas in what it is to be alive at these times.
Yeah, I think this is a question or inquiry we take very seriously. Like, what does it take for us to become more aware, loving, and ethical people? I think psychedelics have potentially a unique role to play, but they're not inherently doing that as maybe naively was thought in the 60s. Just give everyone a high dose of psychedelics and it will be a better place. I don't think that's true at all.
Sure. I mean, at the time, maybe that is good. It turned out it didn't work.
Well, yeah. I think at certain times in certain contexts, that was true for those folks. And they just universalized it. And it with a political backlash, it became very clear that that's not the case. And so we have to be a bit more skillful and wise about what are the risks and dangers. And we also have to act. Like psychedelics are being used in increasing rates. There is counterfeit capital moving in. There are trends where we could say, okay, this is commodifying the sacred. How do we deal with that? And it's not altogether very easy, but I do believe we have to do it together, and we have to speak honestly what our struggles are, and learn from our mistakes, and see, can we become better people by really committing to the path of realization, like integrating our shadow and integrating all these patterns of unconscious behavior that harm. And it's a leap of faith that I try to make, where I believe my life will have had purpose and meaning if I dedicate my life to integrating this in the best way I can imagine. And so far it's been proven right, at least in the capacity of my agency in my world.
I want to, before, again, I keep saying, like, let's talk about this model that you're applying, but not yet. I want to sort of step back a couple of minutes here. And we were talking about, what happens when profit models come in and yada, yada, worst case scenario. At some point in there, good care becomes, like, actually quality care becomes so expensive that it's only available to a very select group of people, for example. But then the opposite might happen as well, where because of all of those things, the underground starts to flourish even more so. And underground care comes with a lot of other possible issues. Now, you spoke earlier about how, decriminalization is not enough, because if you get, like, somebody is traumatized, and because of the larger narrative landscape around psychedelics in the culture, I mean like the culture with a capital C, Western dominant culture, you have people who are seeking out this kind of care, but they can't afford to go to the good clinics, but they end up finding someone who's doing it on the underground, and then might find themselves in circumstances that might be represented on the next season of Power Trip, for example. So there's this whole other degree of harm where if the way psychedelics are getting institutionalized creates this divide between, like, you've got the really rich people who can get the good care, and then you've got all this mediocre, not so good care for still too much money. And then you've got the underground where you have a wash of both, of like amazing care and also like really sketchy stuff. I'm wondering if you want to talk a little bit about whether or not you're holding any concerns around that, or what you see as the concerns might be there.
I think there are a lot of concerns there. I think we need a legalized model because we need some kind of independent regulation. Like synthesis shouldn't police itself. We need independent arbiters that tell us like these are the minimum standards, and hopefully those standards will be really high. That's because then we know what to do, and we don't have to do it ourselves per se. You know, we do it ourselves, but we're not the only ones that have to do that. And I think collectively we can inform the public on what proper care is, and they hopefully help inform them make better decisions. And there's no such thing as informed consent if that is not fully clear what the harms and dangers are, et cetera, et cetera. One of the things that, and we've spoken about this as well, critiques to synthesis that were one of the more expensive organizations, and that's true. And you know, I can offer the very simple explanation. Well, the quality that we offer just costs a lot, and that's also true. But I think it all kind of is besides the point, because I think that the question is then posed like, why does it cost so much? Well, I can tell you, I can show you the books. This is why it costs this much, and it's not that like we're not profitable. So it's not that we are skimming off a lot of value. But I think the real question is not why does it cost so much, but who is paying for it? And I think the answer to that is there is enough capital in the world to pay it for everyone. And collectively, we don't. And I think that goes for almost all externalities, like mental health, but also the ecological impact. Like, we could change it, and we're still on time to change it. And I hope within the next generation, there will be enough leaders that have seen the follies of the generation that's now kind of in power and embodies the hyper individual / selfish type of power grabber into something that, okay, the way to go through this phase of our evolution, we need something else. We need a new form of leader, and one that's way more generous and understands that, there's just a few things that democracy can't fully solve. And so, yeah, you could even go as far as a failure of democracy on some level, where those who are voted in representative power are incentivized in such a way that they cannot fully touch some decisions. They will never make a decision that could risk their own kind of career, or that's super rare. It's definitely not the rule. And, that's a problem. And to put that burden on a tiny organization like Synthesis, I think is kind of like a, it's like there's only so much responsibility we can take.
Mm-hmm.
And so preferably, we could say, okay, this is how much proper psychedelic care costs, and in cases of real psychological wounding, it's going to take many years, and it takes a lot of support of different professionals, and not just mental health, but also the reintegration of them in society, like other forms of health, physical health, education. Like there's a role, like there's a societal way where we can do better. And we're definitely going to try and do our part, but we can't do everything. And I'm happy to go into the specifics of how we think about some models. But these bigger, larger issues, they are real issues, and I don't think there's an easy answer to them.
Mm-hmm.
Although there's one perspective that I like, and I think that is actually historically true, where the trend is quite positive, and from the viewpoint of the the amount of care we have for the victim, which is actually a deeply Christian idea that didn't really exist yet, arguably before Christ, and that compassion about the meek or the weak that has increased almost all facets. It's so normal now. We don't even we can't even imagine how it was like without it. And so that has been extending to more and more categories. So I do believe there is some growth in our ethics and morality. At least that's what I believe.
Yeah. With respect specifically to Christianity and compassion, I can't say much to that one way or another. I know there are lots of historical examples of like compassion for all beings, the Bodhisattva vow, etc. The different indigenous tribes who like see that their work is to hold together the sacredness of the planet for all life upon it and this kind of thing. Like, but one thing I wanted to step back on was this idea that there's lots of capital to pay for certain things, but they're not being paid for. Like here in Ontario, there's this sort of systematic defunding of healthcare of all varieties for decades now. And even during that thing that happened in 2020, I don't want to get any flags on YouTube, that thing that happened in 2020 and still continues now, in that there was a lot of discussion about like, it's just so intense, it's taking over our medical system and we got to this and we got to that, rather than we've systematically defunded healthcare for the last few decades. And as a consequence, we don't have the appropriate, we don't have the resilient enough infrastructure to handle something like this, despite knowing for decades that something like this was likely to happen. And just wondering about that, because the defunding continues in all sorts of places, while simultaneously the richest people who have ever existed exist now. Like hundreds of billions of dollars technically owned by single individuals. And so when I think about where's the funding for something like, like publicly funded healthcare, which could include psilocybin or not, come from? Well, it would come from, it would come from skimming off the top of the profits of large organizations rather than it coming down to the individual. This is what's coming to my mind. And so I don't know if that's where you lined up with, but it was interesting to see that sounding much more sort of like socialist, maybe, even when you had said like, yeah, you believe that capitalism can actually be quite good and that you're an entrepreneur and stuff. And I remember our conversation, you had said something like wondering about, not that you knew, but like wondering like about forms of capitalism that don't, I think you said fuck humanity, but like essentially fuck the entire planet. And
did I say that? I don't remember that.
I mean, maybe that's the note that I put. But
I think you said that.
Sorry to put that. Yeah, I used the F word, not you, Martin. My apologies.
I don't believe we should fuck humanity. I think humanity is beautiful and the world is beautiful. And
no. That it's possible to figure out forms of capitalism that don't do that, but our present forms of capitalism are doing that, and that it's is the word incumbent? It's on us to figure that out. Like it's on us now to be figuring out like how do we shift what we're doing. Because the way, like maybe capitalism itself is not the problem. It's like the way in which it's set up to run right now. And if we shift the way it's set up to run, it could actually flip and become the beautiful thing that is, what's Charles Eisenstein, the more beautiful world our hearts know is possible, or something like that, for all the criticisms of him as a writer. But
So then we go deep into political philosophy and I can't say I'm an expert on that per se. I do
Me either.
It's like these topics have been debated throughout history, and it's easy to lose ourselves in the abstract. And what I definitely, when I was younger, I was a fan of that, and the more abstract the better. But these days it's more, okay, what are the actual problems I could solve in front of me? And those are really hard enough. those are really hard enough. Um, just to, like, what does equity and fairness mean with accepting people on a retreat and those who can't afford it? And how do you find ways to pay for that? And those, okay, but what about those who can't afford a retreat, but also can't afford to travel, and great. And then those who actually cannot take the time off, actually, they need to get paid to come. What about those? And so it's like, okay, this is a huge problem. And the long-term intent is really to solve for all of those. But then we can't accept everyone. We still have to make a selection. And so no matter what, there's a limit to what we can do. And we're going to explore that limit. And that's kind of the time where, that's where I want to spend my time.
Cool. I really appreciate that. I think it's important for people to go, hey, I really don't know what I'm talking about with regards to politics. It's very like water spider. But I appreciate you shifting that. And that's sort of like, I see it as almost like a maturation process, perhaps, or maybe just a developmental process. To say one thing is more or less mature is maybe a little too much hubris, but that we would shift from going into the far abstract to like really zoning in on what actually exists right now that we can solve. Because going to the abstract is important. We need to be able to do that. And I think there's also a lot of going there as a way of evading the responsibility of actually doing what are the problems right here, right now that I need to address. So
I see that a lot, actually.
I would imagine in the psychedelic space, especially, there's a lot of people who have a lot of big ideas, right?
Yeah, and it's like almost none of them survive when you actually try and do something, because it's just really hard to do things, and it's relatively easy to provide critique, and it's very safe. And not that we don't need critique, we need that as well. But it's, I think on average, my view on humanity is we're all trying to do our best. Most of us were not set up for success, and we are quite limited. Even, for example, you talk about maturity, and I think that's one of the best way to look at it. Like, we need to become a more mature culture. And, if you look in history, how many people could you really pinpoint and say, okay, they were mature beyond their time? It's super unique. And even that, we don't even know the historical accuracy of that. They turned into myths. And so I think that is a beautiful ideal, but it's an ideal to aim for, but not to judge us, because I think it's just the amount of realization of awareness we've already gotten over the last few centuries. It's just, I can understand, like, this is not easy. Like, it's not easy to be human, and there's a lot of suffering. And so I do feel that's a calling to come to terms with that, and to build something beautiful that redeems that. But yeah, I think we shouldn't be so quick to judge, and really try and help people. And I think that's part of the maturity that psychedelics can help us with, if we do our jobs right.
Yeah, there's a lot there about both aligning ourselves, maybe not sort of aiming for it, but aligning ourselves with a certain kind of like principles that psychedelics tend to wake up in some people some of the time. I mean, a lot of people a lot of the time, but not every person every time. Something like, I don't know, choose love. It sounds ridiculous and trite to say it, because you're like, yeah, choose love. But anyone who's been there is like, yeah, of course. Like, because it was everything in that moment. Hold on. Go ahead, because I think I was starting to lose what I was saying.
No, but I think choose love is a beautiful aspiration, but you'll quickly find out how difficult that is. And it's a lifelong practice. And it's, I've been very grateful to have met a few people whose lifelong practice was choosing love, and not like this blind love, or I'm gonna be naively have no boundaries, or no, like really committed smart people that have these big insights, and then they okay, that's the insight. Now I'm gonna implement it and integrate that and live by these principles, and just go through that challenge. And it's possible, and it's beautiful, and I think it's worth aspiring to.
Sure. Yeah. It's like, I'm just thinking about the idea of like, okay, there's feeling what it is to choose love when you're in the space, and it's transcendent, and it's at like the highest level of abstraction. It's like God, like
permeates
part of my language, and then there's, what does it actually mean to choose that when I'm tired and I'm hungry and I'm in traffic and I just got a phone call and now I'm irritated, and like what is it to choose love in that moment, right? Or like or in relationships, and when things are triggered and when wounds are alive and you don't have your best mind available because you're regressed because something's come up. What does it mean to choose love then? What does it mean to be in having chosen love and lived and worked and related with others in a way that in those moments, the choosing of love is held by a larger structure than just your own personal choices, because it's in the people around you and how they show up to you in your times of distress and need. So it's like, now you extend that, all of a sudden choose love is a lot more complex and a lot more of a life practice than feeling really good when you look at the sky, not that it discludes that. Right. So that's great. I love what we're on right now.
I love love too.
Nice. So, all right. So speaking about integrating, living it, synthesis, you said, has now, like, it's official. It's, I know you didn't say locked in, but that's the term that's coming up. And now you're headed in the direction of this new model. I think that you've called steward ownership, which you are holding as something that helps perhaps to safeguard the sacred. Can you give us an understanding of what that is, to the best of what's possible to be spoken about?
The steward ownership is basically two principles. One is the right to self-determinate. So in the end, the company will own itself, and it will basically not be able, the control of the company will not be able to be sold to anything besides itself. So it exists for its own purpose. And then second, the rule that money should enhance and provide and support the purpose. It is a means towards the purpose. It should not be a means to itself. And so it should be reinvested. It should be used for education. It should be donated. It's also be used to pay those people back that put risk capital in. It should also be paid for founders that dedicate their lives to it, and to the team that dedicated their lives to the mission. But at one point, it shouldn't be this lifelong growing piggy bank for a few privileged institutions or people, and that can really help, I think, and we believe, to protect the psychedelic space. Because in the end, the stewards, those who steward this work, should have a say in what is actually done in an organization. And they should be empowered to steer the direction towards the purpose. That's basically it in a nutshell.
Is this this language is going to be weird. Is this like a proprietary, did you come up with this model at Synthesis, or is this sort of an established model? And there's a secondary question to this, which is like, how legally binding is it? Like, as long as Synthesis exists, it can only be this, or what?
So it is definitely not something we came up. We had many heated discussions on what the future of synthesis should be, and I was pretty hesitant to, like, as the main founder, if you will, with the most control and the most also economic potential. I was very protective on not sharing it too widely or too committing to a process too soon before I really felt, okay, this is something I can trust. And what I wanted to know, are there historical examples of it actually working? Because, there was a time where, I've read Marx, and I've studied a little bit of political philosophy in university, and most of those movements failed. Like, I'm not naive that you think, okay, you can just give everybody something and it's just going to work automatically. No, these are you have to deal with human nature, and psychedelics don't dismantle the difficulty that we have sometimes relating to each other, specifically in economic terms. And so we went looking, and we found this concept basically, and it's been implemented successfully across organizations, across industries. I wouldn't say for as long as the idea of private property, but as long as the idea of like a modern company. And so there are, and I think the main idea, if anybody listens to this who wants to remember the main thing, it's like, okay, how do we safeguard the purpose of the company over many generations? That the original founders were not there anymore, and I've handed it over. Like, I want the person to be as committed, as insightful as I was, hopefully better.
Mm-hmm.
And I would hate it for it to go public and then be cut apart and sold to pieces. That would be terrifying.
Mm-hmm.
And so we found an organization that supported us with the transition. We had to have many difficult conversations with investors. We bought one investor out who we knew was not aligned with this future. We made a big request. It's basically, hey, there's a limit to the economic upside. It's not unlimited, and we have to agree on what that is. And there's also a limit to control. But it's not just for you; it's also for us. So can we make that commitment together that in the end, the company can sustain itself and can honor why it exists for the purpose of healing and awakening, our planet. And so you asked, I think, a very, very wise question, which is, what is the kind of legal protection? And it's the strongest possible. And so they kind of call it ownership hacking, which is, how do you create a system where no matter what, the fundamental rule of these two principles cannot be undermined. And so, for example, in Europe, there is the idea of basically creating 4 types of shares. There are, for example, founder shares that have economic returns. There are investor shares that have economic returns. There are steward shares that have control but no economic returns. And then there's the golden share, which basically is put into a independent foundation. That foundation is the strongest legal form that we have, and it has all kinds of veto power. And for example, it can prevent the company from being sold. It can prevent the company from changing its statutes. I think that's the right English word, to change these principles.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of the high level. And then on the ground, you have to figure out, okay, who are those stewards? Where are they in the process of decision making? Who they're going to be? And so we talked about, okay, who are the right people to steward this work? Like, I would love to create a very, rich organization that then is stewarded by, indigenous elders, by philosophers, by people who understand economics, by scientists, by like this wide-ranging committee. And I don't want everything decided to be by committee, but the right people in the right spot can steward this, I think, way better than I as a founder can. And I think that goes that goes for almost every company. It's very rare, and I think I can bring it to a certain level, and the team can bring it to a certain level. But at one point, I will, I'm going to be interested in something else, or I'm going to die. What happens then?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's what we're building now, and it's a process that costs a lot of time, a lot of thinking, but there are enough examples that help us to not make the same mistakes and have a significant amount of trust that it's going to work.
Mm. So there are two things that are actually three things now that come up from what you were saying. You had mentioned indigenous peoples, and so I want to talk about that in a moment. But first, there was something that you had said about like hoping or like intending, can't remember the exact word, that synthesis, committing to, and sort of like coming to increasingly embody this business model as an organization providing psychedelic foodstuffs to people, that it would benefit psychedelic culture in some way. Now, in my mind, right off the bat, it's like, I think, as being a positive example, maybe, or like as making it so there's at least one company that is operating under these principles. But are you seeing, or are you kind of like holding a vision that the impact is greater than that? Like, how is it that you're envisioning the potential? I know you can't say this for sure, it's the edge of your thinking, but how are you seeing the potential of this move on behalf of synthesis having positive benefits on the psychedelic culture and the sort of the movement of psychedelics in the world right now?
Yeah, great question. Thank you. Like, in a way, we are all our relations, and therefore we cannot just take responsibility for ourselves. We have to take responsibilities for our surroundings. And we've always tried to be an example that in such a way that has basically, by and large, two effects. One, inspirational. Like, if they can do it, we can do it too. That's kind of trying to reach the goodness of folks. Like, let's together have these principles, and then we safeguard the wall space as one. And the other side, and that's also something we've noticed, is the better we can do ourselves, the more ethical we can do our work, and the more we can communicate accurately the value of that hopefully increases the informed consent people can have. Okay, I want to go with this organization and not this organization. Drives the success for us, and will be a competitive advantage that will force the whole field to move towards that. And so the more responsibility we can take for ethics, and that's still a very open question, and we have an amazing, really rich advisory group of, I think it's like 20, 30 people now that are actively advising on these different types of topics for us. People that have been part of the space or different spaces, but are experts in their field. The more ethical we can do that, and the more we can shift the whole space in a certain direction. And I think that's just really cool to try, see how far we can get doing that. And so far, it's been a philosophy that's really been paying off, because like one of the reasons why we're so expensive is we spend a lot of time educating and screening people and telling people, no, we don't think you're ready, or to the extent you're dealing with things that have happened to you, we're not ready. And and we could have said to everyone, yes, and we would have made a lot more money. We reduced our cost and increased our income by really significantly. I don't know the exact numbers because we don't care about that, but it's we would never, because of steward ownership, we would never have to unwisely reduce those standards. And that's I think that's what I think psychedelic companies have to do, because I think the work is too important. In its highest glory, it is sacred, and it does redeem. These experiences do redeem the suffering of the world, and it can show what is possible, and can remind us the gift that life is. And if that is possible, then anything less than that is like, okay, cool, interesting. We've seen some fireworks, and not, and it's still fine to do it at times, but that's not what we're interested in. And this should at least exist. It should be at least an option, and be at least into consideration. So that's kind of how I'm personally holding that.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And also it's a large, what's the word I'm looking for? I had a discussion recently on the podcast. It was in support of the ethnopharmacologic search for psychoactive plants. Dennis McKenna's, upcoming as of the date of this recording, having passed by the time it gets released, his conference. And I had like a psychedelic cafe, and at some point I can't remember what came up, but I just talked about the enormity of the challenge and the power of the forces that are in play now that we would be, working in conflict with, not necessarily battle, but certainly conflict with. And that there is a real sense of like whether or not, like an uncertainty leaning ever so slightly, but notably to the hopelessness degree of how successful our efforts would actually be. And David, I can't remember his last name, made a comment of like, well, that doesn't matter whether or not it's successful. What matters is like doing it anyways, because it's what feels deep in your heart as the right thing to do. And even if, even if the stewardship model and synthesis, as things just get more and more money into it, that model, like, it just doesn't outcompete the influx of money and capital and marketing and all the rest, and 5, 10, 20 years down the line, it didn't succeed in that hopefulness. You did it though, right? So it's like, and ideally there's a positive outcome, but it doesn't, and you want it to succeed. We want it to succeed, but whether or not it actually will succeed is not the basis upon which deciding whether or not to move with it, if that makes sense. I'm not trying to put that on you, but it's what's coming up for me.
Like, there's a probability of success, and to the extent you can increase the probability, you have to do it. I think it's as simple as that. And you never know beforehand. But I do know that more and more companies we've been speaking to are very interested and are doing it. And therefore, what we've also noticed, it makes partnership and collaboration, which is one of our fundamental values, much easier, because we know that we don't have to fully optimize for the proper economic relations, because if their purpose is significantly overlapping with our purpose, it doesn't matter if their organization wins or our organization wins. It's not this zero-sum game anymore where we're partnering, but we're also competing, which is still true on some level, but we're competing towards something else that we both want. And the nature of these conversations is very different and way more trustworthy. And these are still early days. Like, I have personally have no full understanding what the implications will be. Like, we're still very early, and what I have found is, and I want to thank all our funders like directly, because they trusted us with this step, and they didn't have to, and they were well within their economic rights to insist the kind of previous agreement that before we even thought about these things in the early days when they supported us. But they want to see the same thing. And so I think we can do it. I think working together, I think, by and large, humans are pretty darn good. And, I've traveled the world everywhere. And in most contexts, most places, people are super friendly, rich and poor. Like, I definitely don't discriminate. And I think it's really worth trying, and for you as well, like be a leader and be a voice of reason and goodness and kindness, and like we've never fully realized the impact we have on the world, but I think every day trying to just make it a little bit better, smile a little bit more, be a bit more helpful, spend a bit more time with people that need your help, and just try to chip away at problems that could benefit others, I think helped, create the world we are in today. And I'm deeply grateful, like from where I've come from to where I am now, and my journey of entrepreneurship. Like I couldn't have dreamed of having this rich life and having met these people and having these colleagues and friends. And if I look back, yes, there were very hard periods in my life, but by and large, I was surrounded by love and surrounded by support. And, that's the beauty of humanity. I think there's a lot of amazing qualities we have. And we have still a lot of learning to do, a lot of growing up to do. And that's what it's all about. I really enjoy it. And if I can, in that process, leave something behind that had a positive impact on people, and I think that is, what else is there to do? It's like deeply meaningful to me. I hope it is that for other people too. And I know I just enjoy it. It's hard, but I enjoy the hardship in a way.
Yeah, I mean, hearing you talk about in the earlier part of what you were saying there. In the later part, there's something else, but in the earlier part too, like listening to you talk about it and like, yeah, I mean, like thinking about it based on what I've heard you say, I can't, like, even with the conflict with like the larger forces, my thoughts are like, if something that isn't different than what we're doing doesn't make it, I don't think we're going to make it, period. So it's not like, oh, dang, capitalism won out. It's like, oh, dang, we actually just totally destroyed ourselves in the long run. Or not capitalism, but evil forces. Yeah. And like listening to you talk about it, it's like, yeah, I mean, there has to be an effort, and I think that the people who, especially in the psychedelic space, and even people who know nothing about it, who are leaning into it, there's going to be a recognition that something from, okay, I think about Stephen Jenkinson a lot. And one of his premises, or his, pieces of wisdom have to do with money. And he talks about money as being like water, in a sense that it takes the shape of whatever you put it in. It just flows on its own, I guess, if you leave it. But generally, it's sort of like it does what the context of it directs it to do. And that I've come up against conflict many times in my life where, and you've probably heard this, where shitty actions against each other are like, it's just business, or like, it's just business. That's how money works. In the recognition of like, that's not how money works. Money works in the way that we use it. And sure, there are larger economic forces at play that are directing how money can be used to a significant degree, and fair enough. But how we use money is not us operating on behalf of money. It's money operating on behalf of us. And his premise is like, how you use or don't use your money, how you spend it or don't spend it, how you relate to it or don't relate to it, all of that is actually a reflection of yourself, not a reflection of money. And so in thinking about, and this is part of the things I wanted to get to of the three, In our prep conversation, we had a discussion about the difference between integrating psychedelics into the mainstream, into mainstream institutions, and psychedelicizing those institutions.
Right.
And in many ways, although, you didn't come up with this model, the fact of choosing to move towards that sounds like it's an effort towards that sort of psychedelicizing the institution. And in the larger psychedelic culture, it's hard for me to frame how that model or something akin to it wouldn't win out over the sort of like darker capitalist forces trying to wedge their way into the psychedelic space, because it's not cannabis. It's not going to maximize profitability the way, a lot of investors are probably thinking it will. If you open space for you to respond to that.
Thanks. I can comment on that for sure. What are the things that I think highlights what you're talking about is, let's say a person comes with a certain form of uneasiness, and that is the decider for them to, for example, take psychedelic therapy. And let's say, for argument's sake, they go to a clinical research study on depression, and they get really high quality tailored care for a period. And after that, often the care just stops and they cannot even continue for all kinds of reasons, some really good reasons, but also, very difficult for these folks. And what happens is, it seems on average, most people benefit, and they, and some people, benefit for life, and it's amazing. That's great. But also on average, most people gravitate back to their old selves. And the question then needs to be asked, which is, what made them sick to begin with?
Yes.
And if that is, to the extent that is a systemic problem, we need to change the systems. And the question then doesn't become, okay, how do we heal the individual? How do we heal the collective? And I think one of the delusions of the West, or the delusions or illusions of the Western individual, is that we believe ourselves to be a self that's completely independent. And, I think that's been proven very reliably wrong across scientific domains.
Wrong and explicitly harmful.
Yes.
Yeah.
Also can be incredibly empowering in certain ways. So it has this historical, I think, genesis, its own reason. But the question then becomes, okay, how can we start by chipping away at what caused us to become sick to begin with? And so the way we approach it is, well, there's a disconnect from nature. So psychedelic experiences should be in nature. We should be able to withdraw from the city life and be with non-human, like we are our relations, and we become human by being more in touch with non-human. That's fact number one. Second, we need to be with each other, not just in the role of society that we normally have to function to make, to make ends meet, but to take off our masks and connect with our shared humanity, with a deep sense of your fears are my fears, your loves are my fears, my loves, and there's nothing human that I'm not alien to, and vice versa. And that's something we see every sharing circle with retreats. It's really this light goes on in people, and they feel this connection, and that's gorgeous. And the third thing, which I think goes even deeper, how can we create institutions that set people up for the proper conditions that they did not become sick to begin with, that integrate these values? So we have democratic institutions. We have, and those didn't exist before. We have We have legal, we have healthcare, and yes, there's a lot of wrong to it, but in general, we live longer, and on average, we are healthier than almost any of our ancestors. And so now I think we also need institutions around consciousness that allow us to come to terms with the deep depth that we have, that we don't have to repress, we don't have to hide or dissociate, and we can come with our traumas, we can come with our insecurities, and together we can find a space where it's safe to lower our protections and be guided, be held, and we find the conditions for our healing to occur. And if capital doesn't flow towards that, I think as a community, we have failed. And those people who are anti-capitalist, it's like they say money is almost a dirty thing.
Mm-hmm.
I say you're consciously not using the tools that can help us make a change, because capital can get things done, and it does, like, by and large everywhere, and it is available, and there are amazing people with enough capital that would support amazing other individuals to do great things. And so I get a bit heated, as you can tell, because there are people around that they have amazing hearts and great minds, but they're stuck in this positionality of disempowering themselves. And maybe it's safe, but I think now is not the time to sit back and wait for other people to decide for you, and so, yeah, I hope, I don't know how it's going to look like. I don't know exactly what that means for synthesis yet, but I would love to find a new form of institutions that are steward owned, that safeguard these principles, so the psychedelic experience can be held in the most sacred way possible, the most significant, meaningful, existential meaningful way possible, whatever form that will take for us moderns. Because I think that is also like a very open question, like the sense making around it, which models, which perspectives, and we're so rich these days. Like, we have access to, everything that's still around. Like, of course, we've lost a lot of amazing, great cultures along the way, but there's so much wisdom there, and we have access to all of it. So, yeah, there's something we need to do with that, and relatively quickly.
Yeah, there's something with, I just loved what you just said. That whole line that you walked with us there was really beautiful. So just saying that felt really beautiful to participate in you speaking that aloud and knowing that others would hear it, and to hear it myself. Yeah, there was something that you had said there about like losing cultures along the way, and all this access to not only information, but in some sense access to wisdom as well, even though our access to elders is significantly hindered culturally in a lot of places, at least here in Canada. I mean, elders in the sense of like the eldering role, not elders in the sense that you are legally determined by the government to now be an elder because you're past a certain age point.
Can't drive a car anymore.
Right. Yeah, you're officially an elder.
Yeah.
But there's something earlier you were talking about maturity, and I'm thinking about like the maturity to wield that access as well, or the capacity to wield it in a mature way, in a way that does give back, knowing that we are all our relations. But I want to open up one more line of inquiry before quickly asking you about Oregon and then coming to a close on the conversation. And that is, especially when you said, we've lost cultures along the way. We have. And that's a loss on behalf of the entire planet, especially when there were cultures that were lost simply by the fact of the force of colonial domination, right? Some cultures might have been lost just because they didn't make it, but those that did make it for thousands of years being stomped out by domination, of which I am part of the generation of those. I came here on the coattails of other people's colonizing. Not necessarily did they have ill will in their heart. Some of them likely did. I don't know how much of my ancestry did, but nonetheless, I'm here. And that just there. There's the very real factor that the reason we know these substances and these plant substances and so on and so forth have like healing power, capacity, and there are longstanding traditions and knowledge. Like you talked about the synthesis, there's that scientific understanding, and then there's that other way of understanding it. And if you can't synthesize these together, then you might not get the full breadth of what these substances have to offer us. Well, the indigenous people have been holding that other side, even in the face of, in many respects, it having become, punishable by death for doing their
violence,
practices,
repression,
right? Horrible stuff. So, how are you, and in some respects, of course, how is synthesis holding your role in the larger movement of psychedelics with respect to indigenous peoples? And I mean, indigenous rights is a huge issue, but with specific respect to substances, where are you holding yourself and synthesis in that sort of like relational dynamic right now with indigenous people?
On one hand, there's the personal of me and my mentors, my guides, my elders, and trying to, make them proud, and as a person who will never be able to fully understand what their peoples have gone through. That's my personal relation with them and with their teachings. Then there's the commitment to honor their teachings, that their disappearance and their suffering did not be in vain, but it's actually we as the white man have relearned our roots. I think that's the fundamental commitment that I personally try to make, and to the extent I can influence the thing that synthesis is, it's already independent and moving in a way that it's no longer fully in my control. Then there is the financial support of projects that we believe in, and this is the vetting of those projects, and it's incredibly difficult because who exactly do you support? And it's like you have to be so careful around biases, because you don't want, like, they're not wholly necessarily or without mistakes. And that's one. Then there is, okay, how do we give them a voice? How do we give them access to the same stage of speaking in order to be heard?
Sure. Well, to provide them space to share their voice, because we don't have to give them their voice; they have it, right?
Yeah. To provide a stage so they can, they can be on equal footing as the rest of us.
I understood that's what you meant. That's why I explicitly made the clarification.
I appreciate that. Yeah. There's always sometimes a disconnect between what you think you're saying, what you believe, and then what actually comes out. And So
As a person with a concussion, I feel so familiar with that right now. But yes,
yeah, so
welcome.
sorry to hear that too.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
And then I think there's probably a million things that, because I'm running a business, we're running a business, we're not as aware as we should be. We're making a lot more steps towards that, and we are slowly maturing and understanding what our role is. Like, I don't know if there's ever will be a point we'll be doing enough, but let's aim for that, right? And what does that mean? And yeah, so I think on some level, I think the end perspective, the fundamental first principle is to realize we are indigenous to this planet as well, and the earth is our home, and we cannot do without, and we cannot do it alone, and we cannot do it separately. And I wish that we can hold on to the diversity that is left. Because the richness, like we would just be poorer people if we lose some of the richness of the uniqueness of, language and stories and myths. Yeah, it's something that saddens me deeply as well, because I seen firsthand what generations living under, exploitation, and they're incredibly strong people, and in a way they don't necessarily need our protection, but they we can help them empower themselves, and it's something I do significantly from my personal capacity, and it's something we learn better and better to do as an organization. But yeah, it's one of the many things we'd like to be better at.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that's a huge area of learning right now, and in many ways, it's learning that is the best of it is led by indigenous people, right? Like being like, how can we integrate you, rather than here's how we're going to, Right. And it sounds like. Go ahead.
How would you answer that question?
Oh, honestly, I don't know. I would have to take quite a bit of time to think about that. Like, how would I answer the question? Like, just very simply, for example, I asked you the question, right? So in my role, like I hold that question and I bring it in. So at the very least, even if you had a terrible answer, which you didn't, at least the people listening thought, oh, wait a minute, that's a question that could be asked.
Right.
Explicitly or implicitly, that it is a question that could be asked, and for whatever degree of trust they have in me as the person asking those questions, maybe there's a consideration of it being a question that should be asked. Now, should has relationship to shame and coercive mindset modeling and so on and so forth, so I acknowledge it, but set that aside. Like in the highest quality of what a should could mean for a person, like it's a question that should be asked. And to the best of my present ability, I effort to try to hold that consideration and find voices that fit onto the show in order to talk about it. But
No, I appreciate it.
Yeah, go ahead.
It's a comfortably uncomfortable question, because we're easily confronted with the lack and also the unknowing. Like you said, I don't know. And I think that it's not enough, but it is a start.
Yeah, I mean, it should be uncomfortable. You were talking about like recognizing, going back to our roots, right? Like I spoke to, evidently, I am a white person living in Canada, living in a place called Canada, right? I am generations coming from a colonialist conquest of what was the land here before it was the legal state of Canada, right? And everything, all the atrocious things that were done to the indigenous people here. And so when thinking about roots, yeah, it does go back to the roots are that, and, you know, like I have French roots and English roots. And at some point I am only here really like that at some point my ancestry was indigenous to a place and they were also displaced, likely by the Roman and then Christian conquest. So like there's a lot of history there, and that so I've been displaced, and also I have been participating unconsciously, you know, because I didn't know what was happening. I was just growing up here, right? Educated by people who didn't understand what was happening. They just were living here, right? That part of my roots is accepting how I've come to be here too. And that should be comfortable, right? Or like that, the fact that that's uncomfortable makes sense. It's a horrible feeling thing, you know? Now, do I live my life with like a cloud of blame upon myself? Does that actually serve any kind of reconciliation? No, you know, but should it be like, oh yeah, it's all good. You know, now I've got a poster of Geronimo on my wall, so it's all good, right? So it's like, no, I don't know.
Not quite.
Yeah, exactly. So,
that's something interesting you said, if I may, that we all have ancestors that were indigenous that wanted the best for us and had ways of knowing what that was from their history that did not make it. And so there's like this colonialism that where one dominant culture exterminates or implements forms of cultural genocide, you know, I think has been true throughout history. But it's we all have ancestors that, you know, that something like that has happened, and we cannot connect to those anymore. And knowing that there's a lag, we've had great grandmothers and fathers that whose language we didn't learn, whose stories we don't know, and connecting with that sense of what it means to be disconnected from that, I think allows a place of compassion and understanding what is present for other people right now, and hopefully can create bridges into not these weird kind of dynamic that we feel better or superior or the opposite, but hey, we're now here as people and we're both resilient and we're both smart and we're both different ways. Let's find ways to work together, and you do see trends at different places, at least where I've been privy to, of people that you know, that use modern technology and go to the courts to win cases to get their ancestral lands, to protect illegal poaching and drilling and mining, and they're successful doing it. And they do social media, and they use and it's amazing to see that diversity. And you know, sometimes I believe that I see like, wow, I wish I had part of that, because it seems that there's an authenticity that, at least from the outside, of being that rooted in their culture, that I just feel more like drifting, you know, because I don't have that per se as a child of the Enlightenment. Yeah.
Now, what's interesting there is how you came, and similar to myself, to integrate that not being there, right? It's like indigenous people live in the ongoing presence of what they've lost, right? Where we live in the ongoing absence of what we've lost, you know? And so because, you know, well, you're in a different situation because you're in the Netherlands, and like there was nothing there but swamp before your peoples came to live there, right? So, what was I saying there? there's another way to respond to that sort of sense of there not being a something there, right? Being so far disconnected from the ancestry and all the rest. And it goes, well, but we look the same. And so there must be a lineage of our skin color, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then all of a sudden, instead of being like, oh, I'm disconnected from all of this, and there was all this displacement and all this horrible stuff done, and I have to recognize that I'm in that, and I've lost all this cultural heritage as a consequence, and all that's left is sort of like whatever's available to me as a Canadian, which doesn't necessarily feel all that deep, and certainly doesn't feel all that good when you really wonder about what Canada has actually done as a state to people and to land. That doesn't feel good, but another way of looking at it could be like, oh, I could also actually form this idea in my mind of a kind of heritage that doesn't actually exist. And I can double down with other people who look like me and say, yeah, this is my heritage. And it's a strong, proud heritage. It's a strong, white, proud heritage. Now you've got this, like, we have this opportunity to see, like, here's the situation that you're in. You and I have been like, oh shit, like, that's not good. This doesn't feel good. How do we support the indigenous people? How do we do this and this? Well, another way of looking at it is I'm going to dissociate from all of that shadow stuff. I'm going to double down on this distorted identity where I need to, like, demand and like domineer and all the rest in order to feel stable in my sense of self. And it becomes this distorted fiction of there being some kind of, quote, white heritage, and that it's somehow better than everything else. And I mean, like, I don't know, I'm kind of going off on a tangent here, but like, to me, I see
just a little bit.
Yeah, I see that sort of like, I see that sort of discomfort that we were talking about as a kind of shadow that unintegrated can become this sort of like distorted place of hate and domination.
Yeah, I think it's just, if there's a vacuum, like I do believe that every single person has the right to have a proud heritage. And I can't fully answer what it is for me, because we can go very deep in the history of language and consciousness and dislocation and dissociation, and but in a way, you could argue, what our confusion entails and what our action leads to is like this deep form of feeling of displacement and non-locality and not being completely rooted. And like the communities that existed before, of multi-generational, like that doesn't exist anymore. Like the elders, like you said, have like that hold that wisdom of holding community together. They're super rare. And if they're not true for you, then what are you doing trying to get access to that? It doesn't work for you because you don't have the language or the history. So we're these, humans are already pretty weird creatures, but us moderns are weirdly weird. And so, I don't think we fully understand what it means to have that heritage. I don't. I don't know many people that do. And it seems like we can live without it, but it also creates this susceptibility to all market forces and everything else around us. Like we're more susceptible to our context than we even dream, even though we think we're individualists. We're really not, because we don't have this cultural anchor outside of our historicity, our happenstance, place in time and space. So I don't have an answer to it.
I'd be surprised if you did. It's a pretty big question. And I just went off on wondering about how, like the instability of a cultural identity that exists across multiple generations, that includes both the positive and the negative and the connection to heritage, that disconnection could create a type of internal deep distress that led by the context of certain ideologies that could lead a person to doubling down on a kind of hateful heritage identity that isn't actually real. Like there's no such thing as like the white heritage. Like that's like, you know, like that's an invention. Like it's not real.
Most of the things we believe are not real. And it's like, I think with the displacement of work, and I think for a lot of people, it's been traumatizing to a degree of like realizing we're not the center of the universe. We're an animal, and so we don't have full transparency in what is going on, and there's an unconscious. Like these are all kinds of really big views that are like, just to integrate those is like a full-time job almost. And so for a lot of people, they need to cling to something, and in a vacuum, I think it makes sense that you need something to feel proud of, and to like without that, that's also not having a dignified life. And and often that comes at a cost, like us versus them, which I hope is a mode of being we can outgrow at one point. But I also think that's almost I've been thinking about this, and I'm really sorry for all the people that have been checking in that wanted to learn about synthesis and an organization in the psychedelic space, and we're going off on these philosophical tangents.
Well, they've already tuned out and heard what they needed to hear at this point anyway.
Okay.
So
yeah, now's the time to sign off. No, now's the time to support your podcast with any financial capacity you have, because I think independent creators like yourself are such a significant role within the ecosystem. But where I was going with this is there's almost this evolutionary like there's a evolutionary benefit for those who believe in evolution. I think most people that listen to your podcast do, but to feel separated and to have an us versus them, because those who don't have a separate sense of self, with the boundaries between self and other and you and the universe, most times, except in like orgasmic love and a mother and or a parent and their child, not feeling you're part of the surroundings, I think, benefits survival. And it's hard to blame people, I think, for these, like blaming them at the point where they believe these things, I think is like way too late. It's like, and the blaming and the pointing of fingers doesn't really provide much constructive ways forward either. I don't have the answers, but I know that's not it.
Yeah, you know, I agree. And I appreciate you bringing in an extra compassionate edge. Like, I hold that too. It's not like I'm like, fucking white supremacists, fuck them. They're bad. They're bad. Punish them. I mean, like, horrible acts of violence and hatred should come with some sort of like consequence, obviously. Not like, crimes committed need some sort of address, harms cause, like you said, like support of the victim. These are all important things to hang on. But I wasn't just like, oh, they're all
I know
so on and so forth. So I appreciate you bringing in that compassionate piece. There's a whole other level too of me also recognizing that, I feel that way, and I also recognize I'm a light-skinned person. So to the extent to which white as a racial identity in a racially oppressive hierarchical system, I am that according to the system, and thus I am privileged and benefiting in certain ways as well. So it's not like a total dismissal of any of that. It was really just a pure wondering of how like a confused and detached sense of cultural heritage could be overcompensated for through a sort of a distorted lens, and that lens looking something like the invention of a kind of heritage that wasn't there before, which is called the white heritage or something, and then doubling down on its supremacy as a way of compensating for whatever other dark things are in there. But there's more to that too, because I know that my housemate watched this documentary once, and he was telling me about it. It's called Befriending the Enemy. And it was somebody who was not a white person going into white supremacist communities and sort of talking with them and hearing that they, like young people there are grown up being taught that they are like soldiers for God, doing God's work in the world. And their sort of white supremacist actions and all these actions are actually in service to the greatest good, so it's like, it's a totally complex scenario that I don't understand. Really, it was just me wondering about it, and I'm super open to people critically analyzing and giving me good feedback on where I might be mistaken. So yeah, if you want to comment on that further, otherwise let's go back actually to why why I invited you onto the show to talk. Good?
Yeah, no, great.
Okay.
What's the next
okay, the final question.
topic you'd like to...
Okay, so now let's talk about the climate crisis and how we feel about oil companies.
Oh boy.
No.
Oh.
All right, so I wanted to finish off. There's two things, and with our time frame, we can't really explore it. But I know that synthesis is doing or is a part of two specific things that the listeners can leave this interview and move towards looking into more deeply. One of which is you're building a sort of program for training facilitators, and the other of which is you have some sort of relationship happening to a center that's opening up in Oregon, who awesomely has state level legislation for providing psilocybin to people. So if you could give us the download on those two things before, as a sort of rounding up the conversation.
No, I appreciate sharing a bit more about what we do. So on one end, when COVID happened, we started with retreats and we had to pivot, and we had this both idea and problem, like how do we make sure our facilitators are of the highest caliber, understand the synthesized model, and do this work with integrity and ethics, and understand the wider implications, all these. And so when COVID happened, we kind of dusted off all of our ideas into the exploration. Okay, when psychedelics are actually becoming integrated into Western culture, what kind of new role that we now don't have needs to come, it needs to come together, needs to become synthesized. And, in the beginning, we worked with wide variety of healthcare professionals, spiritual caregivers, yoga teachers, meditation teachers, etc. And the training that is now in its second iteration is the psychedelic practitioner training, and where we really try to synthesize, okay, what is needed to actually do this type of work. And we approach it from kind of 4 different lenses. Kind of the cognitive lens, like our understanding, which includes science, but also meaning making, rational meaning making. It contains the wisdom lens, which is really all the topics we just talked about, like how do we relate to the profound? What is our role within this? And we really, at the core of the training is, okay, well, if we want to improve at something, we need to keep practicing it. So there's so much I want to say about it. I don't want to necessarily give this whole marketing speech, but you can find it on synthesisinstitute.com/psychedelic practitioner training. But if you just go to the institute, you'll find it, and it has 4 lenses. It shows what we believe is a very intimate, tight learning group. So you meet with this very small, curated, select people that want to do this work with the same intent as we're doing it, with the same model or similar enough. And the aim is to really train the next generation of psychedelic practitioners. So that's the training. And hopefully, after 10, 15, 20 iterations, we start to really hone in what it means to fulfill this role in society. And it's still not legal in most places. We still don't fully understand the psychedelic institutions they need to become part of, what the wider responsibilities of psychedelics, but we're really tapping into our understanding of amazing partner organizations to give initial shape to that, which we're very, very proud of. I'm very, very like the quality of the program is exceptional. I'm very amazed by what we put together and the people that work towards it. It's really impactful. And the first cohort just finished the first year, and we're deeply thankful for them going on the journey with us, because we learned so much from them. We've been implementing, like, we have this iterative process of lifelong learning in the organization itself. So we're constantly growing and improving on it. So that's really cool. And then in Oregon, for those who don't know, the residents of Oregon voted yes on something called Measure 109, which basically allows for a legal system, a legalized form of psychedelic access to happen in the United States. And I don't know if everyone fully realizes how big this is and what it means for the psychedelic space, because it allows for experiences with a not necessarily clinical model, and it allows for all kinds of cultural forms to arise, and that's really, really exciting. And so it was a grassroots effort, like Synthesis was from the beginning, and it's the only model in the world that allows us to do the work the way we want to do it. And so we found a beautiful retreat center that's obviously not open, it's not fully legalized yet, but we're working towards it. And we're very excited to offer this to people in the United States. I think it's something I did not believe was possible when we started Synthesis, and how quickly that happened, and the amount of amazing people that want something similar to happen. I think these are the conversations, and those are the moments that really give me a lot of hope.
Cool.
So if you're interested in the psychedelic experience with Synthesis in the United States, it seems that it will be likely within a year.
Wow.
Possible.
Wow. It's wild. Where can people find out? Well, let's do the final closing. Martijn Schirp, so great having you on the show. Thanks for coming in, sharing what you shared, going to some extra interesting places with me. And how can the listeners follow up from this conversation to learn more about Synthesis and or follow you as a person on social media?
Yeah, great. Thank you. And for allowing these half-formulated thoughts and wonderings to entertain them. It's good fun. And important too, I think. It's important to talk about these things, even though we don't fully know, and trying to make sense of it. And hopefully in a couple of years or decades time, we look back and hopefully we realize how ignorant and stupid we were and how much we've learned. That's a personal goal of mine.
Well, I mean, that seems to be the trend in my life thus far. So hopefully it keeps going.
It's trending the right direction.
Yeah.
So for our retreats, you can go to synthesisretreat.com. Currently, they're only in the Netherlands, and we have different programming. I don't know if this podcast will come out on time, but we have actually an amazing leadership retreat come up in partnership with University of Maryland. We'll do one of the world's first type of research on how meaningful psychedelic experience. We can't guarantee it's really meaningful, but we have optimized all conditions that it's likely that to happen. But the impact will be on leaders and their organizations and on decision making, like all stakeholders and future horizon and their connectedness. It's really, really important work, and we're very excited to support that. It will happen in July. So yeah, for retreats on tinseretreat.com, and for our training, you go to tinsetinstitute.com. And I'm on Instagram, not very active, but maybe this year was my intention to speak more publicly and maybe post a bit more too. So you can just find me at Martijn. That's with IJN, which is IJ is that one letter in Dutch. Schirp, SCHIRP.
Great. I am now, speaking of the trend, I'm realizing that 5 minutes ago I was ignorant to how to pronounce your first name properly.
No worries. I've heard all versions.
Yeah. Okay. So Martijn, thank you so much for being on Adventures Through the Mind. I will make sure all of those links are contained in the show notes of this episode for the listeners. And wherever you're listening to it, there will be a quick link to jump over to find those. So, Martijn, thank you very much.
Thanks, James. I appreciate you and your work.
And cut. Okay, thank you very much for tuning into this episode of the podcast. You made it all the way to the end. Awesome. Thank you. If you'd like to support the show or to just generally give back in some way for the value received in this episode, a really easy way to do that is to like and share this podcast with someone you feel would appreciate it, or just scattergun it onto your internet feeds wherever they might be. If you'd like to give back financially for the value received in listening to this episode, you could become a patron on Patreon, purchase something from the online shop, or just leave a one-time PayPal donation or crypto donation. Links to do so are in the description to this episode. And if it is specifically Martijn's work and synthesis that you are interested in, all the contact links, that he mentioned at the end of the interview will be in the show notes to this episode at jameswjesso.com. There's a link to jump over to that, again, in the description to this episode. In the show notes, I will also include links to their facilitators training and to the retreat schedule, that they have coming up for 2022. Again, all those links are at jameswjesso.com. So again, thank you so much for listening all the way to the end of this episode. And until the next episode of Adventures Through the Mind, take care.